Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
It's time to turn off the lights and turn on the dark.
Chilling tales for dark nights.
Good evening, listener. You're listening to Chilling Tales for Dark Nights. On tonight's edition, we invite you to leave behind your safe reality and descend with us into the frightening depths of the most terrifying imaginations, with 2 audio adaptations of frightening fiction about insidious invaders and gory golden years. I'm your host, Paul J. McSorley, and tonight I'll be your guide as we traverse the dimly lit corridors of your darkest dreams. Joining us tonight to help bring to life the frightening fiction of Thomas O. and A.W. Mason is Paul J. McSorley and Otis Gyrie. Now get your ticket ready, take your seat in our theater of the minds, and brace yourself. It's time to turn off the lights and turn on the dark. Our first tale this evening is written by Thomas O. and is performed by Paul J. McSorley. In it, we meet 2 soldiers trying to make their way into their enemy-guarded city. Getting in is one thing. Getting out is an entirely different matter. Now, without further ado, I present to you 3 Truths. The 2 men, perched on a steep hillside, watched from a safe distance as the invading army destroyed the city below them. The towering stone wall that protected the city, once strong and unbreakable, couldn't hold back the onslaught. Even over the sounds of war, the watchers could hear the yells of the invading commanders directing their soldiers. No man, woman, child, or beast was to be left alive. The instructions were carried out with swords and spears, and the slaughter was completed in the space of a day. The 2 watchers, Donnell and Corrette, understood the implications of what they had witnessed. The destroyed city was not the one from which they hailed. No, their city was the next closest, about a 2-day march away. Nearly a year earlier, along with several other soldiers, the 2 men had left their city on a mission to escort an ambassador to a faraway land. The mission had soured, and the ambassador was dead. On the return journey, the other soldiers had become victims of either the desert heat or nomadic attackers. Donnell and Corrette, the last survivors of the mission, were on their way home to report the failure of the undertaking. The 2 men had nearly stumbled, unexpectedly and accidentally, into the army of the invaders. It was an army from a land they weren't familiar with. Luckily for them, they remained undiscovered, but a return to their own city was beginning to look impossible. Half the invading army had already marched off, even while the other half continued with the slaughter. Donnell and Corrette watched as the foreign soldiers headed toward their city, and they could hear the commanders talking their men up for yet another siege. They considered trying to get out ahead of the traveling invaders so that maybe, just maybe, they could reach their city first to give warning. But the quickest route was through a small canyon, which was the same route the invaders were taking. They knew it would be impossible to follow that course and not be spotted. They chose a longer route and hoped that the extra distance would be negated by the fact that 2 lonely men could travel faster than an invading army. Upon their arrival, they found that they were too late. Their city was already surrounded by the first half of the invasion force. Soon the rest of them would arrive and the attack would begin. Donnell and Corrette didn't have to discuss it. They both knew their city's fate would be the same as its neighbor. The invaders wanted this land for themselves, and their army was mightier than any they had seen before. It seemed as if it was guided by an unstoppable force. The walls of their city would fall even faster than those of the city that came before. They found a well-hidden position on a hillside, grimly observing the preparations unfolding down below them.
"It's hopeless. We can do nothing for them,"
Corette lamented. Danelle rubbed a stone amulet that hung around his neck, a subconscious movement he made whenever he was deep in thought. Finally, he responded, "I won't leave her there. I can't just let her die with the rest of them." He looked down upon the doomed city he had served faithfully. At a young age, he had been ripped from his mother and given to the army. Trained to be a soldier, he was the property of the city itself. All of his life, he had followed pointless orders, fought in battles, and then followed even more pointless orders, never questioning his superiors or their motives. As he surveyed the scene, he wasn't surprised that, save for one, he felt no concern or pity for the inhabitants he served. He had done all he could for them. Now, at the start of their inevitable demise, there was no sadness for the city itself, just a stoic acceptance. Donatia, his wife, was the only person for whom Danelle spared concern. His battlefield heroics had allowed him the privilege of marrying her. Most of the soldiers weren't given that luxury. She was the only woman he had ever loved, and she was the only person who had ever loved him. His marriage and his friendship with Corette were the only two important relationships he had ever formed. Corette spoke, breaking Danelle's concentration. "There's a way in, you know." Danelle averted his gaze from the city and looked at Corette. He was listening. Corette continued. "The tunnel. I told you about it before, remember?" Danelle remembered. The ancient and forgotten tunnel ran from a hidden room underneath one of the city's temples and exited outside the walls at the base of a hill. Corette and his long-ago friends had explored the narrow space in their youth. Of that group, Corette was the only one still living. As for the tunnel, its outside entrance was hidden by a boulder, but two strong men could budget just enough to crawl inside. Corette was unsure if anyone else even knew of its existence. Corette's voice intensified. "We'll sneak in tonight. The entire army isn't here yet, so we should be able to make it past their lines." He pointed to a spot towards the southern end of the city, outside its wall. "Look there. What luck for us. They don't have many soldiers in that area. That's where the tunnel's entrance is. A small group could easily sneak in and out." Both men studied the area, and Corette gave a wide smile and put his hand reassuringly on Danelle's shoulder. "My friend, tonight we shall save your wife together." Danelle rubbed his amulet and responded, "Let's get some rest. We have much to accomplish." He was grateful that he had Corette with him, but he wondered how workable the plan really was. At dusk, the two men laid themselves in the dirt, trying to get their first sleep in 3 days. Their plan was straightforward. They would wake up after the half-moon slipped below the horizon and sneak their way to the mouth of the entrance. They would quietly move the boulder aside and slip into the city. Once they were inside, nobody would bother them. They would retrieve Donatia and slip back out. Danelle's sleep was fitful, and he dreamed of both Donatia and a strange figure who stood behind her while she danced. The figure, a silhouette of a large man, had no distinguishable facial features. Donatia danced around the figure, and Danelle could tell the figure was watching her, even though he couldn't see its eyes. Finally, the dark figure spoke to him. "I can help you save her." His voice made a hissing sound. Donatia continued to dance seductively, and the figure repeated itself. "I can help you save her. But you must wake up now." Danelle opened his eyes. It was night. The starry sky and half-moon provided the only light. As he sat up, he saw the outline of the being he had just dreamt of standing right next to him. He made a grab for his sword. "No," the creature hissed. Danelle felt an unseen force push his arm back down, away from his sword. "You will listen." "Who are you?"
I'm the one that you called upon.
The entity remained featureless, even under the moonlight. A black arm extended from the darkness that enveloped the being, brushing a finger against the amulet hanging from Danel's neck. Danel looked down at his amulet. You are Baal?
Yes,
came the hissing response. I didn't call you here. I have no need of you. Danel was more nervous than his bold statement made him appear.
Oh, but you did call me here. Every time you rub that object around your neck, you call out my name.
Danel glanced down at the amulet. He had found the simple stone carving in the dirt several years earlier. At the time, he had recognized that it was a depiction of Baal, one of the deities worshipped by his people. He began wearing it, not out of reverence and not out of fear, but simply because it was something to wear, something that would distinguish him from the nameless soldiers with whom he shared ranks. The truth was, he'd always had very little use for the deities of his people. He didn't find it necessary to pray to them and didn't feel the need to honor them. Before that night, he wasn't even sure they were real. Yet, there he found himself, standing next to a creature that could only be a deity. The visitor continued.
This plan of yours to sneak into the city through a tunnel, this plan is foolish.
The scorn in his voice was evident.
It will not succeed, and you will die. Karet will die. Donatia will die.
Danel started to feel real fear for the first time in years. The legends involving Baal weren't pleasant. He didn't rule with benevolence, but used intimidation and fear to force people towards his will. He reveled in trickery and deceit. He bathed in blood and fed on sadness. Baal's voice took a friendlier turn.
But you don't all have to die. I can get you into the city and out again. However, it will require a sacrifice on your part.
With that last statement, he turned and looked at Karet, who was in a deep sleep. A look of understanding slowly formed on Danel's face. You want me to kill my friend?
I want his heart,
Baal said as the hostility returned to his voice.
You will look him in the eye, then you will cut into him and rip it out of his chest. Then you'll give it to me. In return, I will grant you the power to get into the city and safely retrieve one person of your choosing.
Slowly, Danel shook his head back and forth. I won't do it. He's my only friend.
Do you really think that you'll be able to sneak past that army? You will all die. But if you walk the path I set out for you, then only he dies.
Danel agonized over the choice. The more he considered Karet's plan, the more he came to believe that it was a fool's errand that could only end in tragedy. The dark figure stood patiently while Danel debated himself in torment. Finally, his pragmatic nature and his training as a soldier led him to make the difficult decision. I'll sacrifice my friend to you, and I'll give you his heart. But first, you must grant me 3 truths before I commit. Daniel couldn't bring himself to look at the entity as he spoke.
3 truths. Of course. You would be a fool not to ask that of me.
It seemed as if the figure might have smiled as he said those words. Danel had been well versed in the legends and superstitions of his people, even though he never had too much faith in them. The tradition of the 3 truths specified that a person, before making a pact with a deity, could ask 3 questions. If the deity agreed to answer, it would be unable to lie. The one limitation of the questions was that they had to be asked in a manner that could be answered with a simple yes or no, though the legend held that the deity could provide additional information if it chose to. The priests of Danel's city swore this to be true, and the man, formerly of little faith, was about to put their teachings to the test. Danel took a moment to compose his thoughts. He knew there was a good chance Ball was involved in some sort of trickery, and it was possible that nothing he had said up to that point was true. He had to ask smart questions. A sudden sinking feeling fell upon him as he thought to himself that Donatia might have already passed away in his absence. My first question: is Donatia still alive? Ball nodded his head. Yes, she is alive. She is healthy. She is in your home, yearning for you. Danel was relieved at the answer and pleasantly surprised at the extra information Ball had provided. My second question: were you honest when you said that you'll provide me with the ability to enter the city and safely leave with Donatia? Again, Ball nodded. Yes. So long as you give me your friend's heart, you can leave with Donatia. Or perhaps your father, or maybe your brother. You can pick anyone in the city. Danel wanted to smile but held back. Now I understand his trickery, he thought. He thinks I care for my father and brother. He thinks I'm going to have a difficult time choosing who to take. Ball didn't appear to know that Danel hated both his father and his brother. His father was the one who had ripped him away from his mother and sold him to the army. He barely knew his brother, but he did know that he was an awful man who wasn't worthy of saving. The choice would be easy, very easy, but he didn't want an emotional expression to betray him to Ball. He forced a look of turmoil upon his face. Feeling more confident in the path Ball had laid out for him, his concern turned back to Corette. He knew that people sacrificed to Ball were often killed in the most excruciating ways possible. My third question: you told me that you wanted Corette's heart cut out. That could be long and painful for him. Will you allow him a quick death? Yes, I will allow you to give him a quick death. You may choose any means of execution, so long as you don't damage the heart. Danel hung his head in relief. Ball hissed again. You have your 3 truths. Now go get me his heart. Danel turned and faced the spot where Corette had been sleeping, only to find him sitting up awake. How long have you been awake? He demanded. Corette didn't answer the question, but instead made his own inquiry. What was that thing you were talking to? Danel looked to where Ball had been only a moment earlier, but the deity was gone. He turned back and tried to look at Corette, but ended up averting his eyes. I made a deal with him. I've seen that thing before. That was Ball, wasn't it? This is serious, my friend. You shouldn't make deals with him. Yes, Corette, it was Ball. He granted me 3 truths. I can save Donatia. I know that for sure. But we can do that together. We don't need him. No, he told me our plan would fail. He told me we would all die. Corette shook his head. That's wrong. It's a good plan. I must ask, when he told you it wouldn't work, was that one of the 3 truths? Danel felt as if he had been punched in the gut. He didn't answer. Danel, listen to me. I've lived longer than you, and I've traveled farther. I've learned much, and I know that Ball is no deity. He's one of the fallen. The pathway of Ball is the pathway to sorrow. He has no loyalty, not even to those who serve him. Danel didn't want to argue with Corette anymore. He saw no point. He knew the truth. He could save Donatia, and that was all that mattered anymore. He wants your heart. I'm sorry. A look of rage filled Corette's face. He wants my heart? Here, take it, if you think that's what you really need. He stood up, pulled his sword out, then threw it to the ground. Go ahead. Now do what you need to. Danelle drew his sword and shut down his emotions, as he had been trained to do. Corette continued with his rage, hitting his fist against his chest. Take it! I won't stop you! Just rip it out! Danelle's sword lashed out right as Corette finished his last sentence. The very last expression on his face was a look of surprise, as if he hadn't really expected Danelle to strike him. Corette's head flew off his body and landed in a ditch several feet away. For a moment, Danelle fell to his knees in sorrow. The pain of his actions nearly overwhelmed him, but he thought back to the lessons of his youth. For one last time, he pushed his personal feelings aside so that he could complete his mission. The emotions weren't suppressed easily, but nonetheless, Danelle regained his focus. Drawing his knife, he sliced into Corette's belly and up into his rib cage. After several minutes of cutting and tugging, he retrieved the heart of his friend. The hissing voice sounded out behind him. Make a fire and blacken the heart. I will tell you when it's done. I'll give my location away if I make a fire, Danelle protested. Do not worry about that. I will make sure they don't see you. Danelle made a fire as instructed and placed the heart upon it. Behind him, Paul chanted in an unknown language. The heart burned on the fire until well after the moon went down. The night became even darker. You may take the heart off the fire now, Paul instructed. Danelle used some sticks and placed the heart upon a large rock. Paul nodded his approval. Use your knife and make a slit in the heart. Once the slit was made, bright red blood gushed from within and dripped down onto the rock. Now, smear some of the blood onto your forehead. You'll be able to walk into the city undetected. The blood will remain wet. When you select the person you want to bring back, smear some of the blood onto their forehead. You will both be able to leave safely. Remember, you can choose only one. Otherwise, a punishment worse than death will befall anyone who has been touched by the blood. The invaders will attack at midday. You must leave the city before then. Now go and leave the heart here for me. After smearing a generous amount of blood on his forehead, Danelle walked from the hill toward the city. To take his mind off of the death of Corette, he imagined what his future life would be like with Donatia. He knew of several cities that would take them in. It was one of the advantages of being well-traveled. He imagined them both living in a small house far from the invaders. She would give him a son, and his son would grow up with the love and privilege that he himself had never received. They would have many children, and he would no longer be pressed into the service of the army. As he approached the first set of night watch soldiers, he paused and took a deep breath. Their torches burned brightly in the darkness, but they didn't seem to notice him. As he closed in, they stopped moving entirely, as if they were frozen in place. Walking past them, he turned around and continued to eye them. As the distance between Danelle and the soldiers increased, the soldiers slowly started moving again, oblivious to the fact that an enemy had just walked by them. Relieved, his mind began to wander again. He hadn't seen his wife in ages, it seemed. He wondered if she would look different. He thought about how happy she would be to see him, and he smiled at the thought. He finally reached the main gate of the city. The guards on duty looked down on him from high on the wall with vacant stares on their faces. They opened the gate for him without saying a word. Even though the gate was completely open, None of the invaders seemed to notice. Daniel walked into the city and the gate closed behind him. His heart beat faster. He broke into a run, trying to get to his small wooden hovel as fast as possible. The people of the city looked worried. They were crying and arguing. Soldiers were busy fortifying their positions along the wall. Nobody gave any attention to Daniel as he ran through the alleys. Out of breath, he burst through the door of his home. Donatia was awake in bed when he entered. A single lantern illuminated the room. "Daniel!" She screamed out his name in joy as he ran toward her. She looked exactly as he remembered her. They embraced and kissed. He held her close for several moments. He couldn't begin to explain to her how he managed to get there, and she didn't ask. She just accepted his presence happily. Daniel looked into her eyes. "I came back here to save you. We must leave now." "That makes me so happy," she said. "But wait, there's something wonderful I must show you." She moved over to the bed and picked up a small bundle of blankets that he hadn't noticed earlier. She approached him with a smile as he heard a small cry emanate from within the bundle. Inside, he saw a baby, perhaps 3 months old. "Meet your son," Donatia beamed. Daniel looked at the baby, and his heart filled with love and pride. The small child, conceived in the days before he left and birthed in his absence, had the same color eyes as him. Donatia handed the bundle to him, and he held his first and only son closely. However, his smile faded, and his pride quickly turned into horror as he realized the true extent of Baal's evilness. Looking at Donatia and the baby, he remembered what Baal had told him. "Remember, you can choose only one." He knew the choice would be impossible. I hope you enjoyed 3 Truths, as written by Thomas O. and performed by Paul J. McSorley. Our second tale of the evening is written by A.W. Mason and is performed by Otis Gyri. In it, we meet a girl who loves her sisters very much, so much that she would do anything to protect them. Now, without further ado, I present to you Retirement.
Dean ran his fingers along the leather-bound volumes of books. There they sat, stowed away for years like weathered soldiers waiting for parade rest. The dust on the shelves of the small mahogany bookcase wasn't as bad, for the books were among the only things in the musty attic that had moved for some time. And it was about that time again. Time for them to break free from their prison of dust. Each book displayed a different set of years. He stopped at the one labeled 1984 through 89 and tapped the spine with an arthritic finger. He smiled and then removed the book from its spot on the shelf. Dust fluttered into the air like a million tiny gray balloons, floating around in the scant beams of light. With a shaky hand, Dean opened the book to its first page. A driver's license fell out and bounced onto the attic floor. The license pictured a young woman from Iowa. Caressing the photo, Dean picked it up and affixed it back to the page. Next to the ID was a missing person article from the Des Moines Register. The adjacent page included a more recent write-up titled Des Moines Woman Found in Shallow Grave. Dean closed the book and selected another dated 1998 through 2000. Nothing tumbled loose from this volume, but inside, the pages contained similar yellow newspaper clippings and photos of smiling families, red circles drawn around pretty young women in each picture. A few sheets in, a small lock of brittle brown hair lay taped down next to a story from the Fort Myers Gazette. Dean's eyes scanned the article. Local police appear baffled by the third body found in as many weeks near the up-and-coming west end of Bonita Springs. A construction project unearthed the most recent body, which the ME suspects the cause of death to be that of a deep laceration to the throat. Police Chief Matthews did not want to speculate, but he commented that the homicides appear to match the killings of the blue-collar butcher who terrorized wealthy families in Nebraska, Iowa, and Mississippi by kidnapping, torturing, and stabbing his victims, typically the daughters of prominent businessmen. Downstairs, a cacophonous grandfather clock announced the noon hour, reminding Dean that it was time to feed the cat. He shut the book, placed it under his arm, and headed down the attic steps, his weak knees creaking like rusty springs on each rung. In the kitchen, a stout orange tabby sat obediently at an empty chair of dishes. "You hungry, Gacy?" The cat responded with a loud meow as Dean set his book down on the dining room table. The doorbell rang. He froze. Was he expecting company? But he knew the answer to that. Dean rarely talked to his neighbors and led a relatively private life. A shadow stood behind the glass in the front door. Dean crept to the window next to the entrance and, peeking through the blinds, Randall. Scowling, Dean opened the door. "What do you want?" Randall removed his fedora and ran a hand through his sweaty silver hair. A golden St. Christopher medallion hung around his neck, gleaming in the bright sun like a signaling mirror. He removed a handkerchief from his back pocket and dabbed the perspiration forming at his temples. "Invite me in, will you? It's hot out here." "What do you want?" Dean asked again. Randall towered over Dean by at least 6 inches. Their standoff reminded him of the outlaws from the old Western dime store novels he used to read as a young kid. Neither man budged. "Just let me in, Dean," Randall demanded, pushing Dean to the side as he stepped into the foyer. Gacy, still in the kitchen but sensing Randall, hissed, "You got any water? And none of that shit from the sink." Dean grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge and set it on the kitchen counter. The last time his neighbor had dropped by for a surprise visit, the mailbox needed painting and his grass was a little too long. Oh, the woes of living in a retirement community. Rummaging through the pantry, Dean grabbed a bag of cat food. "And to what do I owe this pleasure?" Randall grabbed the water bottle, looked at it, and frowned. Store brand, barely a step up from filthy Florida tap water. He unscrewed the cap and took in a big gulp, allowing tiny rivulets of water to run down his chin. The sharp edges of his starchy polo had begun to bleed through with sweat now that he had begun to cool down. Dean's back was still turned as Randall plopped down at the dining room table. "The homeowners board has an opening. You weren't my first choice. Hell, you weren't even my second. But the board has decided to nominate you for the vacancy." The cat food made a clanking noise as it cascaded into the dish. Was this another trick of Randall's so he could keep an even closer eye on any future bylaw breaking? Gacy purred and rubbed up against Dean's leg. The accusatory fix-it tickets from the HOA were bad enough. Would he actually consider being part of the miserable clan that issued them? Dean reshelved the cat food and started putting away drying dishes from the rack in the sink. Sometimes an overwhelming urge came over him to add one of those association citations to the new leather-bound book. That and an article with information for submitting leads about a certain silver-haired missing person who issued such citations. Dean turned around to decline the offer. "I really don't think..." The sound of rustling pages filled the kitchenette. Dean watched his dormant, decades-long secrets spring to life as Randall leafed through the book. Becoming careless in his old age was not something Dean had anticipated. The scrapbook of vignettes detailing his bloody little transgressions was all he had left. Too weak and sick to perform the acts his mind still lusted after. And the books helped, yes. They brought him back to each crime scene, sating the appetite that his formerly able body yearned to fill. But how could he be so stupid as to leave his precious kill logs out for anyone, especially Randall, to rifle through? Why they sent me back over here to ask you is beyond me, Randall continued as he turned the pages, going deeper into the book. I mean, just look at my place. Pristine lawn, mailbox up to code, pool always clean. And there's you. Had Randall looked up from his book, he would have seen Dean's white knuckles gripping the lip of the kitchen countertop, his face as pallid as a white, up-to-code retirement community mailbox. Regardless of the thermostat reading a cool 72 degrees inside, Dean's temples and brow became saturated with droplets of sweat. He swallowed hard. "You know, Dean, I never took you for a scrapbooker, but you collect some weird shit. Most people, normal people, mind you, have family vacation photos or ticket stubs in these things. My dead wife, in her own grave, could whip up something better than this crap. Who the hell keeps bank cards, patches of denim? This here isn't even your license." The pages stopped turning. Randall raised his head and met Dean's wide-eyed stare. The only sound between them was the laborious humming of the air conditioner outside. Dean's face started to flush and his hands began to tremble. Randall turned his attention back to the book. Newspaper clippings, earrings, credit cards. Randall scanned the back pages until his eyes settled upon an article from the Tampa Tribune headed "Blue-Collar Butcher-Style Murders Suddenly Drop Off." "I think maybe I'll just keep this," Randall said as he pushed himself back from the table, face twisted up in confusion and fear as the breadth of Dean's secret started to set in. His chair fell back as he bolted up. Usually, Dean got ready for his afternoon walk after feeding Gacy. Today was not going to be a walking day. Today was going to be a surviving day. Book clutched tight to his chest, Randall edged his way around the table to the wall next to the foyer. He bumped into a small side table and knocked over a vase holding plastic flowers. The porcelain shattered on the travertine floor and sent Gacy scurrying into the den. "Give me the book." Dean stepped towards his neighbor like a law enforcement officer approaching an armed perp. Randall's free hand splayed against the wall in a blind effort to locate the door. Negotiation now seemed an unlikely choice. The grandfather clock bellowed out the half-hour chime, snapping both men out of their creeping standoff. Randall ran first. His gait was quick considering his age. Dean would not catch him if he made it to the door. Instead, the blue-collar butcher made a beeline to the tall oak clock. Lowering his shoulder, he plowed into the timepiece, sending a lightning shock of pain down his right side. The clock came down fast, scraping the walls as its brass core clawed into the gypsum. The mechanical innards exploded, and loud clangs echoed down the hall. A sickening thud resonated in the foyer as Randall buckled to the floor under the weight of the old clock, crushing his ribs and trapping him underneath the heavy oak. Blood flowed from his nose and mouth. Dean collapsed onto the ground next to Randall, whose chest's upward and downward movement started to slow. The last time Dean felt this kind of power over somebody seemed so long ago it was like a foggy dream. He made his way back to his knees and ogled his newest victim. You can't. Randall managed. His breath grew shallower with each draw. There wasn't much time left if Dean wanted to get some work in. "Actually," Dean said, "I can." He rose, both knees popping like shotguns, and staggered over to the kitchen. He had collected various styles of chef knives over the years, a culinary hobby to replace the one he felt until now was years and years behind him. But the closest at hand was a 6-inch Santoku. It shined duly in the fluorescent light. He smiled. A fine choice. "You're not as pretty as my usual victims," Dean called from the kitchen. "You're quite ugly if we're speaking in truths." He returned, weapon in hand, and hovered over Randall. Dean dropped down so that his lips floated just above Randall's ear. But things change, don't they? Tastes change. We grow old, and things always seem to change. Dean pushed himself back up. He looked down at the man pinned under the grandfather clock and grinned. "I used to hate peaches when I was a kid. Now I can't get enough of them. Yeah, things do change. And you see, friend, even Kiss had to come out of retirement for their final farewell tour." Still smiling, Dean raised the blade.
I hope you enjoyed Retirement, as written by A.W. Mason and performed by Otis Gyrie. Both of tonight's tales are brought to us by our friends at Velox. Please visit www.veloxbooks.com to find more from these authors and others. On to the shows. Longtime resident Otis Gyrie has his very own show here on our network, Scary Stories Told in the Dark, which you can hear every Sunday night. We also have Eric Peabody's Horror Hill, a podcast dedicated to some of our deeper and darker tales. We hope you check him out. And Drew Blood's Dark Tales airs Fridays, featuring some southern down-home horror. And don't forget to check out the Fear from the Heartland archives, featuring more than 120 episodes. Well, friends, our weekly descent into the depths has just about come to a close. But before we go, I'd like to take a moment to thank you for joining us tonight, and remind you to take a moment to stop by our iTunes page and leave Chilling Tales for Dark Nights a 5-star review and a kind word. And follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram if you haven't already. And of course, subscribe to us on YouTube, where you can find an archive of our work going back to 2012. And consider signing up as a patron at our website, chillingtalesfordarknights.com, to show your support and get all of our content ad-free. I'm your host of the evening, Paul J. McSorley, and it's been a pleasure. Tune in again next week when we once again turn off the lights and turn on the dark. Sweet dreams, listener. Sweet dreams.
Chilling Tales for Dark Nights.